front involving Mueller, Flynn, Manafort, and Gates. What they mean for a president facing new record low approval ratings. Plus, Donald Trump in South Korea at this hour. We're there live as he comes as close as he's ever going to be to a nuclear Pyongyang. And tragedy in Texas, and the question on the minds of so many tonight, how could such horror unfold in a house of worship? What were the signs? The 11th hour begins now. Well, good evening once again from our NBC News headquarters here in New York. Day 291 of the Trump administration, and tonight finds the president on the other side of the world. Landing this hour in Seoul, South Korea, which will put him roughly 120 miles away from Kim Jong-un, about 30 miles from the DMZ border to the north, easily the most tense stop of his 12-day Asian trip. And back home, the crush of Russia-related events is a huge preoccupation, as is the drumbeat of record low numbers in terms of polling responses on what this president has done or not done in office thus far. A new CNN poll says 36% of Americans approve of the job Trump is doing as president, a new low for him in this poll. 58% disapprove. It's one of several polls out just these past few days showing record low numbers. NBC News has him at 38. Pew Research 34, Fox News 38. And on the Russia front, the issue that will not go away, former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort and his associate Rick Gates back in court today. The judge decided they need to stay on house arrest. He did make one exception for Gates. He's allowed to leave home tomorrow just for enough time to vote in the Virginia gubernatorial election. NBC News also has some new reporting on special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. The headline on this one reads, Mueller has enough evidence to bring charges in Flynn investigation. Three sources say Mueller is applying renewed pressure on Flynn following the indictment on Manafort. As Mueller's investigation progresses incrementally, it can be easy to lose the forest for the trees. The Washington Post has put together a big picture look at where we stand to date, and it's all under a headline that certainly gets your attention. At least 9 people in Trump's orbit had contact with Russians during campaign and transition. This examines the contacts from Don Jr., Jared Kushner, Trump attorney Michael Cohen, George Papadopoulos, Paul Manafort, Carter Page, Jeff Sessions, Michael Flynn, and the campaign foreign policy advisor J.D. Gordon. Here are just some of the ways Trump allies have defended those individuals and those contacts.
Paul Manafort, who's a good man also, by the way, Paul Manafort was replaced long before the election took place. He was only there for a short period of time.
Even General Flynn was a volunteer of the campaign. And then obviously there's been this discussion of Paul Manafort, who played a very limited role for a very limited amount of time.
Carter Page is an individual who the president-elect does not know and was put on notice months ago by the campaign.
I'm very disappointed in Jeff Sessions.
You can fire him.
Look, Jeff, I could, but we'll see what happens. But I appointed a man to a position. And then shortly after he gets the position, he recused himself. I said, what's that all about? Why didn't you tell me that you were going to do that and I wouldn't have appointed you? As far as my son is concerned, my son is a wonderful young man. He took a meeting with a Russian lawyer, not a government lawyer, but a Russian lawyer. It was a short meeting. It was a meeting that went very, very quickly, very fast.
Mr. President, do you remember George Papadopoulos during that March meeting?
I don't remember much about that meeting. It was a very unimportant meeting. Took place a long time. Don't remember much about it.
With that, let's bring in our leadoff panel on a Monday night. Robert Costa, national political reporter with the Washington Post, moderator of Washington Week on PBS. NBC News national political reporter Carol Lee, who is one of the bylined reporters on this new reporting about Robert Mueller. And Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at both Pentagon and CIA and former counsel to House Intel. Good evening. Welcome to you all. Carol, your piece, again, you were one of 3 bylines, deservedly got a lot of the attention this weekend. It was kind of a case you could see people shifting their focus, almost a next man up kind of thing. What are we comfortably reporting tonight about the status of the Flynn investigation, which you point out certainly seems to be a classic squeeze play?
Right. That's exactly right. What we've been told by multiple sources is that the special counsel has essentially gathered enough evidence to bring charges in the investigation into not just Michael Flynn, but also his son, Michael G. Flynn. Now, the significance of this, is that this is the first, as we all know, Michael Flynn served in the White House, and this would be the first time this investigation is moving that close to somebody who had served inside the White House. The other key piece here is that we know that the special counsel is not just looking at things that you would expect, like did Michael Flynn lie to the FBI? Did he properly disclose his contacts with foreign officials? But also what he did while he was serving those 24 days inside the White House, specifically as it relates to his dealings with Turkey. And that opens up a whole other avenue that hasn't so much been explored as some of these other things that we know Michael Flynn did, such as not registering as a foreign agent when the Justice Department said he was doing work that would have benefited a foreign government. So we don't know exactly where this is going to go. And the reason why we've worded our story so carefully is because this could go in the direction of charges being brought. This could go in a direction of Michael Flynn and or his son deciding to cooperate with the investigation if they're not already. But this is clearly a move by the special counsel in the wake of the Paul Manafort indictment to put a real tight squeeze on Michael Flynn.
Carefully worded stories are good. Okay, Jeremy Bash, put on your lawyer hat. Let's say you are representing Mr. Flynn, perhaps even Mr. Flynn and his son. What are you thinking and what are you hoping tonight, incidentally, as we watch live Camp Humphreys, South Korea, as the President and Secretary of State arrived there? Go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think the Flynn legal team has to be worried about three main claims. First, unregistered lobbying on behalf of the government of Turkey. Second, potentially conspiring to deport or maybe even kidnap one of the Turkish leader's enemies who is a resident of Pennsylvania, this Gulen figure who Mike Flynn talked with some folks about trying to get him out of the country. And third, of course, lying to the FBI when he was National Security Advisor and he was questioned, importantly, about his conversation with the Russian ambassador after the Obama administration put sanctions on Russia for their meddling in the election. So they are facing jeopardy on a number of fronts. I think it's important, though, to distinguish this is a guy, Mike Flynn, who unlike Manafort, Mike Flynn served at the highest levels of our military, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, held the highest security clearance, and during the presidential campaign, he received intelligence briefings from the CIA and from our intelligence community, and so he had access to all that information while he was potentially conducting these illegal acts.
And Jeremy, just so folks know, is this purely transactional as we've seen it on the TV shows? You give and you get and you up the ante on your recollection of, oh, you know, I can speak to this one conversation I had with the president, and you hope that time gets taken off at the other end?
I think there's an element of that, although I would remind folks that Mike Flynn is a very big fish. He was National Security Advisor of the United States of America. So this is not just an effort to get someone up higher in the food chain. He's pretty high up there.
All right, Robert Costa, what do you hear on all of it? Also, how the Trump White House and the Trump circle are reacting to this?
Well, following up on those comments, especially Carol Sharp reporting, we see this is a time of choice for General Flynn as he faces this grand jury investigation. And no one inside of the White House and around President Trump, who I'm talking to, is really aware of how this is all going to unfold. And it has some people on edge, to be sure, because they are wary of Flynn. They know he may be in a tough financial situation personally. Does he become someone who, in their description, flips and starts to really talk to the special counsel about all elements of not only the Trump campaign, but President Trump's orbit of network and associates and the foreign policy front?
And Robert, you go back a bit with Donald Trump and this campaign. The axiom at the time, in the early days, was all the best people were gone. They were spoken for. They were hired. So a lot of the outer rings of the foreign policy intelligentsia weren't there. Is that when the kind of Russian cracks and fissures started appearing and this started seeping into the Trump circle?
That's exactly right, Brian. I remember in the spring of 2016, I went to the Trump Hotel, still unfinished Trump Hotel in Washington, with my colleague Bob Woodward at the Washington Post to interview then candidate Trump. And we encountered one of these foreign policy meetings, all these different figures, Sam Clovis and others around the table meeting with the candidate in kind of a ramshot way. It wasn't a formal meeting that you would expect out of a presidential campaign. And people like Carter Page and Sam Clovis were not part of that beating heart of the foreign policy establishment in Washington. That's not any excuse. This was a major presidential campaign. At the same time, it was evident to me as a reporter that these were people who were operating on their own islands, sometimes in coordination with the campaign, sometimes on their own, and they were not the people you'd really find as a reporter on foreign policy in Washington.
Yeah, I just think people forget the genesis of that and how kind of unstructured this campaign always was. Carol Lee, I don't want you to engage in rampant speculation. I'm tempered by knowing you won't anyway, but what else can you gather from even the publicly available moves you've witnessed from the Mueller team, in addition what you may have gathered and been told about where they are?
Well, I think what you've seen is a very methodical, calculated investigation where, you know, you can, if you look at it from going to the outer circle into closing in on the bigger fish, that's how this feels that like it's going. I also think that this, you know, this idea of the Trump, that Mike Flynn may have done something while serving as this president's national security advisor is a very significant development, and specifically, you know, that the special counsel is looking into whether he made moves in regards to Turkey with the expectation that he might receive millions of dollars on the other end if he was to be successful. This is something that's clearly, this investigation as a whole is starting to take toll on the president. Polls are showing that, and that's only going to get worse for him.
Jeremy, this Washington Post piece that mentions the 9 people that have been gotten to around Trump's orbit. I want to read you a quote here. You've got some consistency here in terms of the Russian tradecraft. The general pattern of Russians appearing to try to find soft spots, to find the soft underbelly of the campaign to make contact, said Steve Hall, who retired from the CIA in 2015 after 30 years running and managing Russia operations, so no rookie. Quote, I just think there's way too much smoke out there for there to be absolutely no fire. Do you concur to that based on all that you know, Jeremy?
Yeah, if you look at the situation with Papadopoulos, he clearly met in London with someone who looks like a cutout or handler for Russian intelligence. And also tonight, we got the first glimpse at the testimony of Carter Page, who testified last week in front of the House Intelligence Committee. The transcript was released tonight. He details all of the Russians he has met with and interacted with from a business perspective over many years. It's clear that Russian government officials and Russian intelligence were all over Carter Page. They may have even sent him to the Trump campaign. He may have been unwitting that they were trying to use him to get inside that campaign.
And Robert Costa, I always ask you this. We've got the president overseas. We've got this Russia preoccupation. And then we have 535 individuals in the building behind you underneath that dome, elected representatives of the government. What are they doing, and what are they thinking right about now about the Trump circle, their ability to work with them and get anything out of this effort?
There's a lot of action, actually, Brian, and there's a lot of silence. And what I mean by that is when we look at what the House Intelligence Committee is doing, interviewing Carter Page, releasing the transcript today, you're seeing these congressional investigations, which have been pretty slow over the last few months, start to pick up speed and provide new information to this national discussion and investigation. At the same time, the Republicans control both the Senate and the House. And when I'm talking to lawmakers up there, they don't want to talk about Russia or President Trump's conduct or anything about the campaign. They want to talk about their proposal on taxes. We'll see how long the Republicans in power will be able to avoid having this be at the forefront.
What a terrific starting panel. Journalism gets no fresher than this. Our great thanks to Robert Costa, Carol Lee, and Jeremy Bash. Up next, will the president change his language toward Little Rocket Man now that they'll be only about 120 miles apart? We'll cover the South Korea leg of the president's trip, getting started, as we mentioned, at this hour on the Pacific Rim, as the 11th hour is just getting started on a Monday night.
Rocket Man should have been handled a long time ago. This shouldn't be handled now, but I'm going to handle it because we have to handle it. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. The era of strategic patience is over. Some people said that my rhetoric is very strong, but look what's happened with very weak rhetoric over the last 25 years.
Some of the president's rhetoric on North Korea and its leader and the nuclear threat that the North poses to all nations within its reach. Starting tonight, this trip the president is on will put him about 30 miles south of the DMZ with North Korea, give or take, and we will get to see if proximity has an effect on language. We have a first-class panel to talk about the Korean Peninsula tonight. Steve Schmidt is with us, a Republican political veteran of the Bush White House and the McCain presidential campaign, and a devoted student of U.S. history. Sue Mi Terry is senior fellow of the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Importantly, a former senior analyst at the CIA and was in charge of this region while at the White House on the NSC. Bob Kerrey is with us, former U.S. Senator from Nebraska, former governor of Nebraska while we're at it, a member of the 9/11 Commission, former Navy SEAL who was among the 73 living recipients of the Medal of Honor. And we welcome our panel. We want to get a report from the traveling White House. Jonathan Lemire, Associated Press White House reporter, is in Seoul, South Korea to cover the president's visit and set the scene for us after what I'm told is about a 3-second satellite delay. So, Jonathan, lay out the stakes for the president's arrival.
Hi, Brian. It's Tuesday afternoon here in Seoul. The president, as you saw, has just touched down here in South Korea, where he's greeted with a lot of uncertainty. There are a number of questions facing him, 3 in particular. First, what sort of relationship does he have with the South Korean president, President Moon? We just saw 2 days in Japan where it was almost a buddy movie with the Prime Minister Abe there. They ate meals together. They golfed together. They even had custom-made hats together. He has no such close ties with this president. They've only met once, and they have very different views in some ways. You know, the President Moon perhaps not as hawkish as to what to do with North Korea as President Trump. A second issue, of course, is the rhetoric, as you mentioned. Fire and fury, little rocket man. Does President Trump say those things here, just 40 miles or so from the DMZ? What is the South Korean response to those things? Does he use that rhetoric? And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, what is the North Koreans' response to that rhetoric? It is certainly their custom that in major events here in Asia, that they often time their missile tests to a landmark, whether in China or somewhere else, something involving the U.S. Will President Trump's presence here in South Korea prompt them to flex their muscles?
That was a good reminder, and thank you for that preview. Jonathan Lemire, who just happens to be, for the purposes of tonight's broadcast, our correspondent on the scene in Seoul, South Korea, waiting the president's arrival in Seoul proper from the military base. Jonathan, thank you. We turn to our questions, and Sue Mi Terry, this is what I want to hear, the language you believe the president should use, and the language were you counseling him as a member of the present-day NSC and White House staff, the language he should strive to avoid?
Well, language he should avoid is about, saying he's going to totally destroy North Korea. I think that kind of language is absolutely unnecessary. He should focus on reaffirming the alliance with South Korea, showing that we're committed to the security of South Korea. South Koreans are very anxious about Trump's potential military option, using military option when it comes to North Korea. South Koreans are also anxious that their security doesn't matter to President Trump, because if you remember, Senator Lindsey Graham said once that Mr. Trump told him that if thousands are going to die, they're going to die over there. This kind of language is very, the South Koreans obviously are very, they don't like this kind of language, and they're concerned the U.S.-South Korea alliance is not as strong as before. The U.S. does not care about their security as before. So I think we need to reaffirm our alliance and show that their security, South Korean security, is absolute from our perspective.
Senator Kerry, what are you hoping for to come out of this?
Well, I hope the president understands it. Well, you know, when he says we have done nothing, we've had a weak policy over the last 25 years, that simply isn't true. The facts don't allow you to make that conclusion.
Good people have worked decades.
No, we've had an armistice in place since 1953. We had a war in South Korea after the North invaded the South. We've had an armistice in place since 1953 and a very strong deterrent force against North Korea. And it's worked. And if you want to provoke them to take a peremptory attack against us, the president is actually following that course of action. So he's actually taking a much weaker course. My personal opinion is it made it even worse by throwing out the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which put us in a very strong position in Asia. He's going to go to China as well, and he's going to find China in a much stronger position as a consequence of us bailing out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because all the Asian nations now are saying, you know, why can we can't count on the United States, particularly when it comes to the economy, and so they're going to go to China.
Steve Schmidt is coming on later in the broadcast to talk politics, but I asked for Steve to be part of this discussion because, Steve, we saw this letter from the Pentagon this weekend to two members of Congress who were asking a question. The Pentagon says to totally root out all of the North's nuclear facilities would require a ground invasion of North Korea. And you alone for a long time have been saying to people, if you want to talk tough about North Korea, call this what it will need to be called, the Second Korean War.
Yeah, the Second Korean War is a frightening prospect, and we've not talked openly and honestly about it. Brian, there are casualty estimates that range as high as 1 million dead on the first day of the war. We have 250,000 American dependents in South Korea, around Seoul. We've seen the competency of the government of the United States with regard to delivering potable drinking water to the island of Puerto Rico, which is much closer to home. And you look at the size of the Marine Corps today. It can fit inside the University of Michigan football stadium in its entirety. The U.S. Army is down to its smallest size since 1940. I think there's a real question when you look at the totality of the active duty components of the U.S. military, throw in all the National Guard and the Reserve, whether we have enough force to occupy, to disarm North Korea. One thing is for certain, you'll see more American casualties in the first 5 minutes of a Second Korean War than we've seen in the last 17 years of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we've seen from this administration is not a lot of thoughtfulness, not a lot of commitment to diplomacy, but a lot of blustering, a lot of loose talk, and a lot of loose talk about nuclear weapons that could have profoundly tragic consequences, not just for the United States, but for the whole of Southeast Asia.
Senator Kerry, you've worn the uniform, and on behalf of 50,000 Americans in Japan, the 28,000 in South Korea, talk is one thing. It's quite different when you talk about an actual land war.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Steve's right. I mean, the casualty rates would be enormous. But again, repeated, Brian, we've had a very strong deterrent action against North Korea since 1953, and it has worked. So when the president says we haven't done anything, God, I'm here now, we're gonna handle this, he's just wrong. He's making it worse. There's no need to provoke North Korea. Yes, their nuclear weapons are a threat. Yes, their rockets are a threat. But we have a very strong deterrent force. But if you want a land war on the Korean Peninsula, I think Steve's absolutely right. It will substantially diminish our capability elsewhere in the world and produce enormous amounts of casualties. I think unacceptable casualties.
Do you think we have a back channel open? Do you think we're talking to somebody through somebody?
Probably. We probably do. Certainly not a sign of weakness.
No.
It oftentimes is seen and suggested as a weakness, but I don't think it's a sign of weakness at all. So, again, I'll repeat it. We've got a very capable deterrent force against North Korea. There's no reason for us to suggest somehow that we're not doing anything. We're doing a lot. And if you provoke it and you make it worse, you can certainly get the North Koreans to do something we wish they wouldn't do, which is to launch a peremptory attack against the South, which would be a disaster both for them and for us.
Sumi Terry, you get the last word. What is the best case scenario where you're concerned?
Well, that Trump leaves South Korea with a reforming alliance, and Seoul and Washington need to get on the same page when it comes to North Korea policy. North Korean problem is already difficult enough. We cannot have divided capitals here. So Seoul and Washington need to get on the same page, and President Trump needs to get President Moon on board when whatever the next steps that he's going to pursue.
Well, consider this a viewer's guide to the visit we're about to watch unfold as the president's only in his first hour on the ground in South Korea. Our thanks to Steve Schmidt, to Sue Mi Terry, to Senator Bob Kerrey, and our man on the ground in Seoul, Jonathan Lemire of the Associated Press and MSNBC for previewing this trip. Thanks to you all. Coming up after another break. Were the signs already there? Was that this was somehow coming? An FBI veteran is with us to take us inside the investigation into this church massacre in Texas. That and more when we come back.